Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise today to address the government's proposed changes to electoral funding, changes that will, if this legislation is enacted, profoundly alter the fairness and accessibility of our democracy. Since I was elected, my independent colleagues and I have been calling for meaningful electoral reform. We want more transparency. We want more fairness in government. For almost 3 years, we have called for legislation ensuring both real-time declaration of significant donations and truth in political advertising to be in place at the next federal election. But this bill will not provide that. 5 days ago, the government announced this electoral donation reform bill. It says that this is the biggest electoral reform in 40 years. It is a 200-page document that the Liberal National Coalition and the Labor government have been working on together for 6 months. My independent colleagues and I first saw it 5 days ago. I was elected member for Kooyong by a community which demanded politics done differently, more transparently, more equitably and with a stronger focus on integrity. These reforms fall short of those values. They fall short of the contract that I made with my constituents to try and improve our governance. Instead of addressing systemic inequalities in our electoral system, this bill will consolidate the advantages of the major parties and the incumbents. It will silence independent emerging voices. The government's proposal to impose restrictive donation caps, while ostensibly aimed at reducing undue influence, will have significant consequences on the ability of challengers to fund competitive campaigns. The caps will disproportionately benefit incumbents and parties, established parties, who already have the advantage of name recognition, of entrenched donor networks and of associated entities which are sometimes worth millions of dollars. There is an alternative approach. My colleague, the member for Curtin, has proposed a more fair donation cap of $1.5 million, which would secure sufficient resources for challengers, if they're able to fundraise to that extent, while still safeguarding against undue influence. This was a thoughtful proposal, which deserves due consideration. But in presenting this bill to the House yesterday, with the stated intention of ramming it through both houses in this fortnight, the government has ensured that due consideration has gone out the window, along with due process, evidence-based analysis and community consultation. It's worth remembering too that donation caps do not prevent cash for access payments to ministers and to shadow ministers. They don't prevent the $10,000 a head dinners held by coteries. They don't prevent the hidden in-kind donations. They're unlikely to limit the effect of those entities which account for a third of the cash which flows into the coffers of the Liberal and Labor parties. Now, the proposed spending caps pose a similar challenge. Caps on spending benefit MPs who are already in Parliament over candidates who choose to run against them at elections. Incumbents have access to a funded car, an office and a comms budget. New candidates have none of these things. These caps will allow parties to concentrate their spending on target seats, enabling them to outspend independent candidates in those seats. Similar legislation in New South Wales and Victoria has already been shown to decimate independent representation. It has been shown to shore up the significant advantages of the flagging, bloated and tired major parties. The most superficial reading of this legislation reveals loopholes which will no doubt be exploited by the parties. For example, the ability to have other entities advertise on one's behalf, or to fund unlimited, non-individually branded party advertising and marginal electorates, siphoning money away from safe seats. There is theoretically a limit on spending in each electorate, but ads that promote parties don't count. Taxpayer funding for political parties will increase significantly under this legislation, from $2.91 per vote to $5 per vote at the next federal election. You will pay more for less choice. Australia does love a duopoly. We see them in our supermarkets and we see them in our aviation industry. And these parties would like to see it in our politics as well. It feels like this legislation should be going to the ACCC, not to the Senate. The parties will be able to spend up to $91 million at every election. Just remember that, $91 million. This for a legislation that purports to put a cap on spending. The legislation gives incumbents funding to cover their paperwork and their reporting requirements, but it offers nothing to new candidates, although the requirements for donation reporting and compliance will be much more strict in future elections for new candidates, including independents. The bill includes 3 pages of exempted gifts. You don't have to declare bequests, loans, subscriptions, and you don't have to declare the party's levies on their members' wages. I'm sure this is all entirely legitimate. The problem is that these big, expensive changes, all of these big, expensive changes, will primarily benefit established parties, not people who operate outside the major political parties. They're not great for independents like me, but for people with incumbency, there are already entrenched advantages. The problem is that this legislation will make it much, much harder for new independents to be elected. This is not the democracy that Australians want or expect. As we consider these sorts of reforms to our own system, it's worth reflecting on international examples. In the United States, the influence of political action committees and super PACs offer a cautionary tale. These entities allow for virtually unlimited donations, often from anonymous sources, resulting in a system in which financial power too often equates to political influence. This approach has fostered an electoral environment in which a small number of wealthy donors and organisations wields disproportionate influence. It can overshadow grassroots participation, and it distorts the democratic process. We have in Australia long prided ourselves on avoiding these pitfalls, but these reforms the reforms proposed in this legislation risk introducing their own version of imbalance. They will restrict challenges while entrenching the power of the major parties. In contrast, countries like Canada have succeeded in imposing donation caps and on requiring full transparency of contributions. And in doing so, they have helped preserve trust in the electoral process. Similarly, New Zealand's MMP system encourages diversity in representation. It ensures that smaller parties and independents do have a voice in shaping government policy. These examples remind us of the importance of designing electoral systems that balance fairness, transparency and inclusivity. The government claims that increased public funding will compensate for its limits on private donations. But greater reliance on public funds risks a system in which parties can become overly dependent on government subsidies, potentially discouraging grassroots engagement and local fundraising efforts. In a cost of living crisis, many Australians are going to, very understandably, resolve from increasing the funding that they are providing to political parties. The administrative support allotted in this bill equates to $30,000 per year per incumbent. For the parties, that is more than $2 million a year each, from taxpayers to political parties to help them with their administrative costs, with no consideration of the economies of scale afforded by the centralised party structure. It's just a question of more taxpayers' money which will be flowing to the major parties. The reforms also failed to address the influence of union funding. As significant donors to the Labor Party, the unions wield considerable sway in our political system. Recent reports linking certain unions to questionable practices only highlights the need for greater transparency and for accountability in this area. Ignoring this issue undermines the credibility of the government's reforms. If we are serious about addressing undue influence, we cannot selectively apply these principles. Transparency has to apply across the board. Deputy Speaker, electoral reform should strengthen our democracy, not weaken it. Australians want a system that fosters participation, that encourages diverse viewpoints and ensures that all voices have a fair chance to be heard. This legislation will benefit the major parties, leaving independent candidates, but especially new candidates, out. It is a stitch-up. Best practice systems are subject to independent external scrutiny and review. The government has told us that this is the most comprehensive electoral reform in 40 years. We're told that the government has been working on this legislation with the Liberal National Party coalition for 6 months. It was first shared with the crossbench 5 days ago. We have been denied the opportunity for appropriate scrutiny and for evaluation of its complexities. Complex pieces of legislation are customarily subjected to detailed committee review. Yesterday, the crossbench tried to have this legislation referred for committee review. This was blocked by the Labor Party and the Liberal Party and the National Party. The Labor Party and the Liberal Party and the National Party do not want this legislation to undergo detailed scrutiny. The Labor Party and the Liberal Party and the National Party do not want this legislation to be analysed and evaluated in detail and at length by academics, the media and the experts. The Labor Party and the Liberal Party and the National Party do not want this legislation to undergo community evaluation. It's not that the Labor Party and the Liberal Party and the National Party are not interested in what Australians think about this legislation. It's just that they just don't want Australians to know about it. Deputy Speaker, this legislation will not affect the 2025 election. There is absolutely no reason to push it through with this unseemly haste, unless the government doesn't want the public to recognise exactly how poorly the major parties are behaving with this bill. The thing is, the public is not stupid. In 2022, 1/3 of Australian voters voted for independence and for small parties. In 2025, we will encourage them to remember this cynical political manoeuvring, this sneaky collusion, and the disrespect that it shows the Australian public when they are deciding who they trust to represent them.